Hi, and welcome to Ran and Focus, a podcast brought to you by the Radicalization Awareness Network. I'm Maya Rosen, and today I'll be talking to frontline practitioners and leading experts about some of the emerging terrorist and extremist threats facing Europe today, and what we really should be paying attention to. After 2 extremely challenging years, the world has been transformed in so many ways, and a whole new set of challenges have been thrown at all of us in the PCV sector. And many of us are still trying to kind of navigate in this new world. So in this episode of Ran and Focus, I'm going to take a look at what some of these challenges might look like and how they might evolve over the next 12 months. To do this, I'm going to be joined by 3 different experts who will be giving us their unique perspectives on 2 topics of particular relevance and interest to RAN practitioners in 2022. First of all, the continuing impact of conspiracy narratives and disinformation, and secondly, the increasing prominence and effect of violent left-wing extremism and anarchist extremism. So I'm really excited about this, so let's dive into it. Colin Clark is the Director of Policy and Research at the Sufon Group, a global intelligence and security consultancy that helps clients operate in high-risk environments. Colin is an expert in conflict and terrorism and recently wrote an article for the Foreign Policy Research Institute in the UK titled Trends in Terrorism, What's on the Horizon for 2022? Welcome, Colin. Thank you for speaking to me today. Colin, as we enter into a new year, 2022, and also, drawing on your latest article, how do you see the terrorist and extremist landscape in Europe at present, but also over the next year or so?
Yeah, I think we're entering a kind of new era or new phase. We basically had 2 decades of the so-called global war on terrorism, where there was a narrow focus on, I would say jihadi groups, Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, and then their various affiliates and offshoots. And so there's still a threat from jihadi groups, especially those that seek to motivate through online propaganda, radicalized individuals in Europe. The UK has had a number of incidents over the past year, but you've also got a really growing threat from far-right extremists. You've got incels or involuntary celibates, a rather kind of strange niche group of violent misogynists. You've got even a rise in some left-wing type terrorism, however you want to kind of characterize some of the disruption by the yellow vest anarchists and others. And from folks that I talk to, including policymakers in the European Union, there's a concern over what we call salad bar ideologies, which is this kind of really interesting phenomenon where people subscribe to a number of different pillars within jihadist and far-right motivations. So they might be a neo-Nazi that's obsessed with Osama bin Laden, counterintuitive on its face, but actually these individuals are just kind of picking and choosing the parts of the ideology that they want. And this poses a real threat for counterterrorism officials because, we've been used to looking at one type of threat or one style of threat, and it's a lot more kaleidoscopic, I would say. We've got to adjust, we've got to adapt, just like terrorists and extremists do.
And what does this diverse threat mean for us as practitioners? How do we need to adapt our working methods?
Got to be more research and kind of learning more about what these ideologies, portend. And then I think the elephant in the room is COVID-19, because we've seen anti-lockdown protests, we've seen anti-vaccine or anti-vaxxer protests, and we've seen them dovetailing, particularly in Europe, with the broader far-right movement. And I think, this weird combination of extremism and the pandemic has made for strange bedfellows. And it occupies a lot of bandwidth and resources from the intelligence community that they could be using for other poignant threats as well. You've got now 5 or 6 different threats when in the past you were really looking at jihadism, which, in and of itself is a formidable threat. But now add on all of these other threat vectors, and it shows you how complex the landscape is at the moment.
This can all feel a bit overwhelming. It's tough, it's challenging, but what can practitioners do to stay on top of this threat?
One of the big things that practitioners can do, especially non-academics, people that are more intervention focused, to read broadly, to listen to podcasts like we're doing now, which is another great resource to get out there and talk to people. Today people are more accessible because of social media. we should always question our assumptions. What we find as researchers or practitioners might not always be what we thought going in. And in many times it's not. But in my work in the field and working on kind of programs like this, to me, the missing ingredient or the area where we really need to focus on improving the most is measurement, evaluation, and assessment, right? It's a critical component that goes into the beginning to track how you're going to assess what you say you're assessing.
Great, amazing. Thank you so much for speaking to me, Colin. That was very, very informative. And yeah, thank you for your work.
Oh, welcome. Anytime. Thank you for having me.
Speaking to Colin, I think the thing that shocked me is threats are coming in from many different angles and organizations, but it's shocking. But, he wasn't expressing any feeling of hopelessness, more of, okay, but this is happening. We need to adapt our working methods and we need to rely on evaluation and measure. I think that's something that we as practitioners really should bring with us in our everyday work. Bettina Rotweiler is a research assistant at the Department for Security and Crime Science at the University College London. She specializes in conspiracy narratives and disinformation and recently appeared on a RAND practitioners film about this subject, which you can find on the RAND YouTube channel. Welcome, Bettina. I'm so happy to speak to you today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
And you appeared in a RAND practitioners film this fall, right? And you spoke about the impact of conspiracy narratives and disinformation in PCVE work. How have things evolved in this short period of time since you took part in that film?
I think there have been several developments. I think what we're seeing increasingly throughout Europe is a violent corona protest movement. So we've seen a lot of anti-lockdown, anti-vax protests across Europe. I think what we've seen recently is that a fringe part of that corona protest movement is radicalizing, and what they're using is a diverse set of conspiracy narratives to fuel and underline their ideology.
And do you think there's a particular group that's extra vulnerable to believing these conspiracy narratives?
What's really important here is to be aware of that we can't just look at individual risk factors, but we really have to look at the constellation of risk factors and how they're interacting with each other. And I think it's also really looking at what protective factors might mitigate the adverse effect. So it's not that easy, and I think just kind of focusing or targeting individual risk factors is probably not a successful strategy. But I think it should really be done from an early preventative perspective, from a public health perspective, where we are trying to tackle these as early as possible.
Do you have any tips on, resilience building practices that practitioners can actually use?
I think in terms of looking at resilience for being susceptible to conspiratorial narratives, I think it's very important if we look, for example, at enhancing media and digital literacy, such as strengthening the ability to critically evaluate the credibility of news sources and really to consider and evaluate information more reflectively. And I think from a preventative perspective, it would probably make sense to incorporate some of these processes within the school curriculum. I think it's really important that kids already learn how to question and evaluate material before sharing it and really asking where does the information come from. I mean, we've seen games can really promote critical engagement with disinformation online. And it has also shown that it really helps people to make more informed judgments about information. We've seen there's a lot of research out now that pre-bunking or inoculation strategy. So when people are preemptively made aware that they might misinformed, it has shown that these people will become more immune to misinformation and can develop some sort of resilience to conspiratorial narratives. And a specific example looked at pre-bunking anti-vaccine conspiracy theories, and they actually have been found to be much more effective than debunking.
There's so much literature and guidance and podcasts and movies and everything you can think about out there. How can I, as a practitioner, best navigate the sometimes I feel insane amount of information and decide on Like, what's the best practice or the best way to work for me?
I think what we're really lacking at the moment is comprehensive evaluation studies. So really to look which intervention studies work best, or which intervention studies works for which target audience.
And how hopeful or fearful do you feel like looking ahead for the rest of 2022 about the role that conspiracy narratives may or may not play?
Well, I always try to be positive and see the good things. I think it's going to be a pretty challenging year. It's all quite unpredictable, I would say. We don't know whether people who hold these extremist and conspiracy beliefs will ever engage in violence or will actually act upon their beliefs and belief systems. However, what we know is that there is a big pool of potential violent extremists out there. So I think it's very challenging, and I think we really need not just preventative strategies, which obviously are always most important, but we also need a lot of mitigation strategies working together with researchers, but also with the CT police. So I think the most important thing is having that multi-agency and whole of society approach. And I think that might be a way in which we can tackle it or try to minimize the risk.
Thank you so much for speaking to me, Bettina. It's been so interesting and very, very helpful.
Thank you, for having me. It's really interesting.
So talking to Bettina, I really got reminded about how important resilience building is. Digital media literacy, critical thinking, analytical thinking, and also debunking and pre-bunking these kind of narratives. Conspiracy narratives and disinformation spread mainly through social media and online spaces is clearly fueling a lot of new movements that we, as PCV practitioners, need to be aware of, since it's really creating a more diverse network of terrorist threats, just like Colin Clark told us before. With this in mind, I come to my final guest, who will be talking about an emerging movement that is slowly gaining more and more prominence in the PCV space and has become mainstream enough for RAND practitioners to focus on in a recently published paper, the violent left-wing extremist and anarchist movement. My guest is Francesco Farinelli, and he is a program director at the European Foundation for Democracy. Francesco is a regular contributor to RAND Practitioners Working Group activities and is the co-author of the RAND Practitioners paper that I just mentioned before, which was published in November 2021. Welcome, Francesco. I'm so happy to speak to you today.
I'm happy to, thanks.
What do you see as the current picture or current level of threat from the violent left-wing extremist movement in Europe as of right now?
There has been a new rise of violent left-wing extremist organizations and individuals in the new millennium. In terms of numbers, from 2006 to 2020, there have been a total of 414 terrorist attacks carried out by violent left-wing extremists, the majority of that in the last few years having been carried out by anarchist groups. Member states that have been targeted are Greece, Italy, Spain, Austria, Denmark, Germany, the Czech Republic, and also France. And in this context, the Mediterranean triangle composed of Italy, Spain, and Greece results in being the most affected one. This means that the level of the threat varies from country to country in the EU.
And just to get things straight, what is the difference between violent left-wing extremism and anarchist extremism, if there is one?
Looking into the attacks conducted in the last 5 years in the EU, inspired by violent left-wing anarchist extremist ideology, most of them come from the anarchist pro-insurrectionism landscape, especially insurrectionary anarchism, is reportedly more stable than left-wing extremism from the point of view of ideology, having shown remarkable ideological consistency, over the last 40 years. On the contrary, the left-wing extremist scenario is ideologically more fluid.
Would you describe this as like a borderless multinational movement?
Well, international linkages undoubtedly characterize the violent left-wing and anarchist extremist scenario, especially among the more extreme factions and violent anarchists and the autonomous cells. Understanding the worldwide network and dynamics of violent left-wing extremism could aid a lot in unraveling the roots of this strand of radicalization. And the outline dimension, if compared to Islamist extremism or right-wing extremism, for instance, they usually do not employ high-profile videos or GIFs as much because personal contacts or face-to-face conversation are still the preferred method of recruiting new militants in many circumstances. However, they also use a variety of website blogs, fringe encrypted social media messaging platforms to attract new followers, while more traditional social media platforms like Twitter or Facebook are primarily used by these extremists to claim responsibility for their attacks.
You're saying that left-wing extremism, they do not typically recruit online, right? So how do we as practitioners, how do we counter that?
So in my view, there is a lack of specific tools in this very moment to prevent this trend of extremism. And we have also to pay attention to the so-called recovery phase of the pandemic, because this will be a very crucial period. I do think that we need to, first of all, study more and research more the phenomenon, then develop tools which are specifically designed for this strand of extremism.
And what other challenges would you say there are for practitioners in developing prevention work in this area?
Maybe the main challenges in facing their low threat perception, which in some cases prevent them to recognize cases of radicalization processes. It is really challenging for some practitioners to identify and target that we could face some issues because their ideologies to some extent are considered closer to mainstream values of society, closer than obviously other ideologies like the right-wing extremism.
And just referring back to your paper, you talk about primary and secondary prevention work, right? Could you just give us a brief rundown and explain what this means, what this is?
The primary prevention, also known as universal prevention, has the overall goal to target the causes or factors that may be at the root of the dynamics of radicalization leading to violence. The secondary prevention programs attempt to reduce vulnerabilities and risk factors in groups and environments that have been recognized as potential breeding grounds for radicalization, such as, for instance, people and groups sympathetic to violent left-wing and anarchist extremism. Necessary prevention concerns work with convicted offenders or those who have already committed hate crimes or acts of violence.
Thank you so much for speaking to me, Francesco. It was really informative and eye-opening, I would say. Thank you.
Thanks to you. It was my pleasure.
Speaking to Francesco, I mean, I was not aware of the high numbers of left-wing terrorist attacks and anarchist terrorist attacks, so I think that was really insightful. But also because it's a new field, I feel like it's hard for practitioners to understand what they can actually do. I feel like, this episode really shows the different types of threats. I mean, we have the left-wing threat, we have the right-wing, for example, and I feel like it's our job as practitioners to really stay on top of these different subjects. And this is nothing new for us. I mean, this is what we do. And do your research, educate yourself, and really use each other and collaborate with each other. Thank you for all of my guests for speaking to me today about some key emerging issues that we really need to be more aware of. Thank you for listening. Thank you, guys. And I really hope you can join me for the next episode of RAN in Focus podcast. See you.